So when it came to increasing along those vertical lines, I was increasing there, but then I also started increasing along the sides as well for the back. And that's where I ran into a problem. Hey nerdy knitter, Tanya here. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a master hand knitter, and I believe knitting is a form of self-care. You can take time for yourself, your creative pursuits, and still create beautiful garments that you love to wear. And I want to talk about modifying a garment, and I went a little crazy modifying this pattern. Flax by Tin Can Knits, the worsted Aran weight version. They've got a few different versions. This is the worsted weight one. And as you can see from the original, and as you can see from mine, I changed a lot about this pattern to really get it to fit the way I wanted it to fit. So we're going to walk through all of those changes. Now, the first issue I ran into was with my gauge. Now, when I swatch on a few needle sizes because I figure it is a much better use of my time. Instead of making one swatch, washing, blocking, taking measurements, finding out it's wrong, and then having to do the whole process again, I knit one swatch with multiple needle sizes, usually 3 needle sizes. For this one, I just went with 2, a US 6 and a US 7. The yarn I chose was Superwash, so I knew I wanted to knit it a little on the tighter side because sometimes Superwash, because it's a little more slippery than untreated wool, can drape more than you want. So it's better to knit it slightly tighter. So I did my gauge on 2 different needle sizes, and neither one of them actually met the gauge for the pattern. But so instead, I just chose the fabric I liked and adjusted the pattern to suit my gauge. And that's totally something that you can do with your knitting patterns. If your gauge isn't matching correctly, you can use your gauge and still use the pattern. You just have to do a little bit of math. Now, the easiest way to do this is to look at your own body measurements, measure your full bust or whatever part you're measuring to get like the full sweater circumference, plus the amount of ease you want. And you're going to take that measurement and multiply it by your 1-inch stitch gauge. And this will give you a ballpark stitch count. Then you're going to go to your pattern and look for the point in the pattern where you've separated the body and the sleeves if you're knitting top down like I did in this sweater. And you're casting on stitches at the underarm and then joining everything in the round. At that point, that's like the body stitch count. And you want to find the size that has the closest stitch count to the count that you want for your body circumference. And then that's the size you're going to follow for your sweater. You could end up following a small and you're a large, or you could end up following an extra large and you're a small. It doesn't really matter. It's just you're using your gauge to figure out the stitch count that you want at the fullest point of the sweater along the body, and then finding the size that's the closest stitch count to that one. Now, of course, that's just the bare bones method of it. Once you have that size, all of the other measurements are going to be off too, because they will be compared. They should be compared to your stitch and row gauge. So you'll have to go through and make sure everything else is going to work. But as a starting point, using your full bust circumference, or if you're using a different measurement for your sweater, using that circumference and using your stitch gauge, you can find a size that you can knit. I've done this multiple times with many sweaters, and I've never run into an issue, but I'm totally fine with ripping things out and redoing them. If you're not, then you might be safer to try to match the gauge of the designer in that pattern. Now, the next change I made was the size that I chose and how I chose it. Most patterns will tell you to use your full bust or full chest circumference, choose a size based on that. And that's okay for some sweaters, but when you want a sweater that's going to be more fitted through the top, and you have a larger bust, like there's a 2-inch difference between your upper bust, when you measure at the underarm, and the fullest point of your bust. If it's more than 2 inches, sometimes you can run into a sweater that is way too big in the top because you chose a size that would fit you in your full bust. If it's very large, then the rest of the sweater is pretty large too. And if you have an average frame along with that full bust, the sweater is going to be too big. And that happens all the time. This is just, patterns are written with a B cup in mind, and that means there is a 2-inch difference more or less from your upper bust and your full bust. If they wrote patterns for every single cup size, those patterns would be enormous. So they take an average. That's how sweaters are, that's how every standard clothing company works. They look at average body sizes and that's what they design and create clothes for. But none of us is average. If you are and you can just knit a pattern and it's going to fit you great, then that is great for you. The rest of us have to take things into account, whether we're short-waisted, long-waisted, petite, broad-shouldered, narrow-shouldered, full-busted, narrow-busted, large arms, small arms, short arms, long arms. Like, there's just so much that you probably want to change in a pattern so it will fit you. And one of the biggest changes is which size you choose and using the appropriate measurement to choose a size. And if you are full busted, an upper arm circumference, or not upper arm, the upper bust circumference is a better choice than your full bust circumference, because then it will fit here. And then you can make other alterations to make it fit your full bust, which is something else that I did as well. And this also works if you have broad shoulders and a narrow bust. If you're choosing a size based on your bust and it's narrow compared to the width of your shoulders, you're going to have a sweater that's too tight in the shoulders but will fit you in the bust. So you have the same issue. You should choose an upper bust measurement, use that as your guide to make sure it's going to fit your shoulders, because that upper bust measurement is more closely related to the width of your shoulders, and then maybe decrease down to narrow it at the bust instead. So once I had chosen this size based on my upper bust, I had checked the rest of the schematic measurements for that size, and I discovered another problem. The sleeve circumference was going to be too small. Now, if I had knit one of those larger sizes to fit my full bust, then the sleeve would have been fine, but it would have been falling off my shoulders, and I didn't want a sweater that was too big in the top. I want a sweater that's going to fit me well here, and then I can make adjustments for all of the fleshy bits everywhere else. But you want to make sure your sweater's fitting your frame first. That's your shoulders and this part of your body, your neck up here. If it's all sitting well right there, you can make all these other changes. But if you're choosing a size that's going to fit the fleshy bits like your bust or your stomach or your arms, then it might not actually fit your frame, especially if you're a little more fleshy like I am. So that was my next problem, was the size I did choose based on that upper bust circumference to fit up here was going to be too tight for my arms. And you want some ease in the arms. You do not want sausage casing sleeves. So I did what I have heard called before a Frankensweater. I've heard Frankensock, basically when you're combining two sizes to make one sweater. So when I looked at that schematic for the size I was going to knit, and of course I had to check it against my stitch gauge because my stitch gauge was not the same as the patterns, and I discovered the sleeve was going to be too small at my upper arm. So I had to look at all of the other sizes, look at the measurements there or the stitch counts there, compare it to my stitch gauge, and find a size that would fit my upper arm, which was 2 sizes larger than the size I chose for the body of the sweater. So when it came to time to cast on and knit, I was looking at stitch counts for one size for the body, and then stitch counts for 2 sizes larger for the sleeves. So what does this actually look like in action? Because it can get really confusing when you're increasing along these raglan lines right here, when you're doing those raglan shaping, if you've got 2 different stitch counts. So what I did was I looked at the size for the arms, and I checked the armhole depth to make sure it would be okay. I didn't want it to be too deep down there. I didn't want it to be droopy and hanging. I wanted it to be pretty close fitting. And the armhole depth was going to be fine compared to my row gauge. So I used the size for my sleeves, but then when it came to the stitch count for the body, I started to change my decrease rate. Now you want to be careful when you do this. If you start changing your rates of decrease or increase for a raglan, I should say increase since we're going this way, then instead of those strong diagonal lines, you can get these weird curves because you're changing the way you're increasing along either the sleeve or the body. So the best thing to do, if it's a standard pattern where it's got like an increase round where you're increasing 8 stitches and then a plain round and then repeating that however many times. I did that for like 2/3 of the top of the sweater. And then I started slowing down on the body stitches because I didn't need as many in the body as I needed for the sleeves. So I still kept my increase rate for the sleeves in that last third, but then I started increasing every 4th round I would do another increase. So I was slowly stopping or changing the rate of that increase just for the body, so I could still end my raglan shaping at the same point as the sleeves, but I didn't need as many stitches in the body. So that is how I combined two sizes. I used the sleeve size and then just made sure I was slowing down the way I was increasing in that last third, because it's going to change the shape of that raglan line and it'll hide under your arm. If you do it everywhere, like the whole length, you're going to get a weird raglan line. It's not going to be like that strong diagonal line that you want. There are other methods, of course, like compound raglans, but in a basic raglan, it's better to change. If you're going to change any shaping, then do it in that bottom third so it'll sort of hide under the underarm. Now, probably the most obvious change is the neckline. In the standard flax pattern, it's just a simple sort of crew boat neck. It's technically a crew neck, but because of the way a raglan is shaped, it sort of becomes like a boat neck shape because it's sort of like this large rectangle that you're knitting for your body, the yoke part. And I really didn't want that. So I decided I really prefer a V-neck sweater. And it seems like it's going to be a difficult change, but it's really not that hard. The only thing is you have to knit flat until your neck shaping is done. So instead of casting on all the stitches for the front neck, I cast on all the stitches for the back neck and the stitches I needed for the sleeve, made note of how many I needed to have for that front neck, and then I cast on like one at each side. I knit straight for a little bit, and then I started increasing on the right side rows one stitch at each edge of the neckline so I could fill in that V-neck shape until I had the same number of stitches I started with for casting on at the back neck. And then I could join in the round. I just put my last stitch in the center, started knitting in the round so I could finish my raglan shaping, and the neckline was done. So it might sound a little confusing. I promise it's not. You just have to knit flat, decide how long you want that V-neck to be. For me, it was just easy to increase one stitch on each end every right side row until it was done, and then start joining in the round and knitting. It was really not that hard, but you have to be willing to try and rip out and redo if it's not working out the way you want. Now the next change came when I was ready to separate the sleeves and the body. I'd finished the whole yoke and I tried it on. I put everything on waste yarn, I washed it, and I tried it on because at that point you want to make sure it's going to fit here. If you're already having issues, then that's the time to stop and fix it. It's not going to fix itself. You don't want to just keep knitting the rest of the sweater and then come back and realize, oh, I should have fixed it back then. Stop and try things on. That's one of the benefits of these top-down sweaters, is that you can put everything on needles, spare needles and waste yarn and try it on. And you should definitely do that. And wash it first. However you're going to care for your finished sweater, do it in process, or at least give it a steam so the stitches can relax and you can try it on. Make sure it's fitting here before you start moving on to do anything else. But my next change did happen when I was ready to separate everything. I wanted a little bit more ease in the arm, even than the size that I had knit. So I cast on 4 extra stitches at each underarm. So that added also a little more in like the circumference of the body of the sweater as well. So when you're going to add extra stitches, that's a good way to do it. If you need a little more in the body or in the sleeve, then cast on some extra stitches at the underarm, but just make sure you write it down so you remember that you cast on extra stitches and you're wondering where these extra stitches came from. And also when you have to go back and pick up your sleeves, you want to make sure you're picking up one for one. Whatever you cast on, you pick up that amount as well. Now the next big change was adding a bust dart. With all of the other changes I had made, I didn't actually have to add a lot of extra fabric for my bust, but sometimes you need to. And a good way to know if you need one is if you ever wear like a close-fitting sweater or top and you are constantly having to tug down the front because it's starting to ride up. That could mean you need some darts. Either they can be for like a stomach, if your stomach or your belly is larger, you can use bust darts there, or in my case, I do have more of a protruding belly as well, but for my bust, sometimes if it's a closer fitting t-shirt, it'll ride up in the front. So I'm constantly pulling it down. So I knew when I knit this sweater, I wanted it to be more close fitting, and the closer fitting it is, the more likely you're going to see that issue. If you have that issue of your sweaters or tops riding up, the closer the fit, the more likely that's going to happen. So I knew I needed to check and see if I needed a bust dart. And when you're knitting top down, this is an easy thing to check. After you have divided the sleeves from the body, you're knitting the body in the round, knit for a couple inches, then stop and try it on. and look sideways, go stand in front of a mirror and look. If the back is sort of like level with your bra band, and then the front, if it's not level with the bra band, but it's sort of tilted up, then you need to fill in that extra space, because you want the front and the back to be like one strong horizontal line all the way around. You don't want to have like the back like this and then the front is like up here somewhere. This is what a bust dart does. It fills in that space so you have this horizontal line all the way around, front and back. And you can see in this clip, this is a different sweater, but I had this issue with that sweater as well, where the back was nice and flat, but then the front sort of tilts up. And this is what you use a bust dart for. A short row bust dart fills in like a little wedge of fabric just across the fullest point of your bust to make sure the front of your garment isn't going to ride up. It's going to be level and the same level as the back. Now when it's laying flat on a bed or on a table, it'll look a little bit odd because the front might be, it's going to look longer than the back. As you can see here, the front of my sweater is actually about an inch or inch and a half longer than the back of my sweater. You don't see that when I'm wearing it because my bust fills out that extra space that I gave it. So that's why a bust dart is a good thing to have in your knitting tool belt. So in those instances, you can pop one in wherever you need it to make some extra fabric where you need it. Now, by the time I got to the body of the sweater, I was completely sort of on my own. My stitch count was different, and in the basic sweater, you just keep knitting until it's long enough, and then you do the hem. And I prefer to have a little shaping in my sweaters. I don't really care for really boxy sweaters. I've got some curves, and boxy sweaters just makes me look kind of lumpy instead of curvy. And I'd rather look curvy than lumpy. So I did a few different things with the body of the sweater. Now, across the front, I have my bust, of course, and I also have my belly, and I didn't want anything being too clingy there. So I put markers along the side seams, and I started increasing to give it sort of like a slight A-line shape, but just across the front. So I was increasing here and here along the side seams to add a little extra fabric to the front so it wouldn't be too clingy across my belly. Now for the back, I decided to do some waist shaping using vertical bust darts. So not bust darts, but vertical darts. So you place markers. For the back, I think you divide it in, like you take half the stitches or a third. You divide them in thirds for the back, and then you put these markers. So you have a third of the stitches in the center and then a third at each side. And those markers are where you can increase and decrease to create sort of these vertical darts and add a little bit of shaping to your sweater. So I did that along the back. I didn't want that across the front on my stomach. Not where I wanted it. Of course, you can do both if you're more curvy in a different way, but for me, I liked it in the back because it sort of nipped things in and made it look like you could see some of my curves without accentuating my stomach in the front. So the front had the A-line slight shaping along the sides. Then on the back, I was decreasing along these markers on those vertical lines just to pull the fabric in a little bit across the back so you could see the curve of my back. And then after that was done, the first time I knit this, yes, I ripped and redid because it didn't work out. I had to increase more quickly because of my stomach, my hips, my bum, like lots of curves going on there. So I wanted to make sure I had enough fabric around the hem so it wouldn't be like super tight. So when it came to increasing along those vertical lines, I was increasing there, but then I also started increasing along the sides as well for the back. And that's where I ran into a problem. When it was done and I tried it on, I had this weird poochy fabric right along the sides. What happened is I had too many increases too quickly, and it just made weird bulges where I didn't have bulges that filled it in. Just didn't work. And this happens when you're trying things and you're increasing too much, you get weird shapes sometimes, and that's what happened here. So I ripped it back to before I started increasing, back to like I had finished the decreasing for the waist. I was at the just knitting straight for an inch or so. I had to pull it back there. And then I kept the front the same. I was still doing my A-line increases, but for the back, I moved all of the increases I wanted to the back. Instead of trying to do some in the sides and in the back, I moved them all to the back. So instead of just having 2 increases along those vertical lines, I had 4. So 1 on each side of the marker to give me extra stitches across my butt basically, so I could have enough fabric there. and I was much more pleased with that. So yes, I took a risk, didn't work out, so I had to rip it out and redo it, but the end result was a much improved. Now, another obvious change is the sleeve length. Like, the regular pattern is a wrist, normal long sleeve, and I didn't really want that. I wanted more of a transition weather sweater. Transition weather sweater. Yeah, say that 5 times fast. So I wanted to shorten the sleeves, and that's just not a difficult alteration. You have to change like your rate of shaping, because obviously I can't, my elbow is wider than my wrist would be, so I had to measure where I wanted my sweater sleeve to finish and make sure I had enough stitches at that point. And then I just decreased until I was there, and then did my little edging. And of course, that was another difference, is instead of, I think it's a knit 2 purl 2 or knit purl, or knit 1 purl 1, I'm not sure what the ribbing is, but I did more of a lace sort of trim. Just a simple pattern I found in one of the Barbara Walker stitch dictionaries. That was another very simple change. Now I'm going to be honest, I'm not completely pleased with this sweater. It's a little short. Like, I wanted something I'm going to wear with jeans, so I didn't want it to be super long. I wanted it to be like, you know, sort of hit the pockets on my jeans. But I think I'm going to rip it out one more time. Just the hem, just the edging on the bottom, which is, I don't know how many rounds, not very many. And just add maybe another inch of stockinette stitch, and then redo the edging hem. Maybe I'll even add more for the hem. I'm not sure. But that is something I still need to do. I haven't done it yet, but I am contemplating that. I'm going to give myself a day to sort of wear it, but I am noticing that I keep pulling on it a little bit because it feels a little short. But this is what happens when you customize a sweater. You have to make choices and decisions, and sometimes they work, and most of them did. My neckline worked just fine. I like my sleeve length. I like the fit through the bust and the shoulders, but I didn't like my shaping when I did it the first time. I had to pull that out and redo it. And I'm not loving the length, so I'm going to pull out the hem and add a little bit more length to the stockinette portion and redo the hem. But adding things to your sweater, making different customizations, it can feel daunting. I know that. But if you start out small, maybe add some waist shaping to your next sweater that's not included in the pattern, or slightly change the sleeve length. These are all adjustments that you can make. They don't have to be as extreme as changing a complete neckline, or just choosing a size based on your upper bust and then making, adding bust darts or some other way to add more fabric for your full bust will give you a sweater that you'll be proud to wear. Like, it will just look like it was made for you and not just a sweater you bought off the rack and would fit a million different bodies. Like, it's just customized to fit your body. And it's so nice when you have a closet full of sweaters like that. Now, if this is something you want some help and guidance with, I do have a workshop where I walked through a group of students with, when I was knitting this sweater, all of the modifications I made and how I did them, and the other modifications that you can make that I didn't actually do in this sweater. There are others as well, but all of that I cover in this workshop. So if that's something you're interested in, is just having more guidance to help you work through that, then you'll find a link for that down below. And I would love it if you would just continue hanging out with me. So I'm going to put a video right here that you may not have seen already, so you can click right through, and I'll see you in the next video.